looking to take your business on the road and become a bit of a digital nomad, or maybe you're just looking at planning that next trip abroad that's not just a hop and a skip away, I have got a fun little video for you today about my travel planning process. And if you don't know me, this is coming to you from someone who travels the world full time for over 3 years, have lived and worked from over 15 different countries in the past 3 years, and have traveled to over 30 different countries. So I'd like to think I got this down to a science, and I'm going to walk you through it. And hello, if you're new here, my name is Amanda Kolbye, and I am a business coach and an online educator for service-based entrepreneurs, helping them grow their online business and their personal brand using social media. So on this channel here, you're gonna find tons and tons of content about marketing, sales, entrepreneurship, and also the digital nomad lifestyle. So if you are looking for some inspiration for where to plan your next trip to, whether you wanna live there for a little while or just go on a vacation, definitely check out some of our playlists here where I have lots of videos that show you like the day in the life in different countries, cost of living in different countries, and just some of our travels as an entrepreneur. And don't forget to like and subscribe to help us creating more of this content for you. And let's dive into my travel planning process. My type A brain, if you don't know me already, loves this stuff. So we are going to be sharing my screen and giving you guys some sneak peeks at just some of the documents and spreadsheets and all that as far as how I actually go through this process. Okay, so first thing just goes without saying, if you've got a certain location in mind, then like check, we're going to move on to flights here in just a second. If you're just like, hey, I want to move somewhere, what are the best digital nomad locations to be able to work remotely from, or where's like a really fun, just vacation to go to, I definitely recommend asking around. So I really like certain Facebook groups, one of them, shameless plug, being my own, where there's a lot of travelers and remote workers who can give you kind of that inside scoop of just like, hey, should I go to Portugal or this? Because before we can start planning the trip, you've got to decide where you want to go. Like I said, though, I also have a lot of videos here on this channel that can give you some inspiration for locations. And if you don't already follow me on Instagram, check me out there, because whenever you're watching this, who knows in the world where I currently am, and you can check out my stories or even shoot me a DM, and I'm happy to give you some recommendations of some fun places to plan your trip to. So let's start with flights, and I'm gonna flip this around and share my screen with you and walk you through how I find the best flights, not only cheap flights, but just really good flights to figure out where you wanna go. Okay, so Google Flights is my go-to. I know there's so many different tools out there that you can use, but Google Flights is truly, truly my favorite. It aggregates, so it's pulling from a bunch of different airlines. There are a couple that it doesn't pull from, but for the majority, I find that this tool is just like the simplest and yet also the easiest as far as features. So let's walk through. So let's say that I am currently in Dallas, Fort Worth, and I want to plan a trip to Europe. So let's say I kind of want to go to Prague and maybe Athens, and we'll go from there. So we're going to go ahead and do a one-way here, just because for me, you'll typically get better deals by booking a round trip. But if I genuinely have no clue where or when I'm coming back, then it's just not worth it. So I'm going to start with Dallas, and I'm actually going to do Europe. So as you can see, I can type this in here. This is one of my favorite ways to search for different flights, just because even if I knew I specifically wanted to go to Prague, I'm still going to search for Europe, because I want to see, since this is a long haul flight, where's the cheapest airport to fly into, because I know that once I get to Europe, I can find a really cheap flight from London or Paris or wherever it is I fly into to Prague. So let's go ahead and do this. And let's say we're going to go in the spring. Let's just pick a random date for right now. Okay, beautiful. So as you can see, now we've got certain prices. You can also set different like limits up here. So if you only want nonstop flights or anything like that, I typically kind of leave it open just so I can really see kind of prices up front, and we're just getting some estimates here. So it looks like Moscow or London, which is not terribly surprising, or Athens actually are probably going to be our best shots. So I actually said it maybe we want to go to Athens, but let's pretend we actually wanted to go to Prague. So let's take a look at the cheapest one here. Let's go with London. So sometimes you'll get really cheap flights, but it's going to be like a 40-hour journey that takes you, you know, through all of these different layovers. So you're going to have to be patient here and do a little bit of digging. But essentially, once we found the flight that we want, if we do decide to go to London, what you're doing is making your own layover. So this is definitely a really good tip for finding the best flights. However, it does come with a little bit of risk. For example, if I did a flight from Dallas to London and then London to Prague, I'm not buying the tickets together. So if the flight from Dallas to London gets canceled or something happens, I don't get refunded for the flight from London to Prague. So you always have to weigh like how much of a risk is that and is it something you're willing to do? The other thing to consider is you have to leave time to go get your bags if you have checked baggage. So once you get into London, you're going to have to go get your bags and recheck in for the flight to Prague because again, the flights were not booked together. So there's definitely some cons here, but if you're an avid traveler, then this is not the biggest deal in the world. You do just have to make sure things are planned accordingly. So the next tip I have for you, if you do have a certain location now that you know you want to fly into, is that if we click here, once we've got the location, you can actually see a price map. And this is something that I really, really love on Google Maps. It does actually show this on Skyscanner as well, which I'll show you in a minute. But as you can see, the cheapest flights are always going to be highlighted in green, which is really nice. And I do recommend having some flexibility in the dates that you travel. If you're going on a vacation and you have to like take time off work, that's obviously a different ordeal, but especially for my entrepreneurs who work for yourself and are able to work remotely, be flexible with the dates that you're going to fly and you'll always get better deals. So another thing that you can do is set up price alerts. You can do this both on Google and Skyscanner. As you can see, this just popped up here. So let's take a look at Skyscanner as well, which sometimes I will check. As you can see from this, I typed in Dallas to London, picked a random date. You have some different options as far as a layout here of best, cheapest, fastest, etc. The other thing you can do is show that whole month view again, similar to what we had with Google Flights. And you're going to be able to see, you know, what the varied price range to be flexible with your dates. You can also see a chart view this way. So just kind of based on how you intake information will be what you choose best. My last tip for you with flights is to book direct. So I do all of this for searching. However, I don't actually book through these mediums because I like to have my flights booked direct 99% of the time, because then if something changes, I don't have to go through a middleman. The only time when I don't book direct is when I use credit card points, which I absolutely love and am mildly obsessed with. But my favorite credit card is the Chase credit card. So Chase Sapphire Preferred and Reserve. And those are really, really great for points for travel in particular. And if you book through their portal, you can use points in certain deals. So that's the only time I use a third-party medium. Okay, so now that you've got your flights, we want to book accommodation. So a lot of times I'll be doing the two of these at the same time, especially if you have super, super flexible dates, especially as a digital nomad. Then I'll kind of see, hey, okay, what dates are the accommodations open? Can we find kind of matching flights to match with that? Or can we stay in a hotel one extra night if the location we want is not available yet? So I really view this as like a puzzle piecing process, especially if you are booking things as a digital nomad and not so much as a vacation, like for 1 week or something. So in general, as a couple, because I do travel with my partner and as people that do work online, most of the time, unless we are on just like a short week-long vacation, then we like staying in Airbnbs just because it gives us more space and it's typically going to have a place for us to be able to cook some of our meals and sit at a table or a desk to be able to do some work. Except in Southeast Asia, we'll only book an Airbnb or a hotel for a night or two, and then we find most of the places that we're going to stay for a month or 2 months or longer on the ground and in person. I would say the two most important things when choosing your accommodation is going to be location and transportation, and looking at those two factors. So I always do a lot of research on both blog posts and then in Facebook groups or just talking to friends to find out the best area of the city or the place I'm staying in, because location is key. And of course, you might even be considering safety or something like that, depending on where you're traveling to. The other thing is transportation. So if you're traveling, especially if it's on vacation for a short period of time, you want to be close to the things you are. And for me personally, location is always king or queen. And so also just looking at how easy is it going to be for where you're at to get to a metro or a bus, or nearby places where maybe like Ubers are going to be a lot, or to the places that you're going to be traveling, so that you don't spend all of your time that you have in a place getting from one place to the other. Okay, so next let's talk a little bit about your budget and money, because before we can plan the itinerary, you need to know how long you're going to be somewhere, what type of travel you're doing. Are you traveling every single day, or are you doing some work? And also what your budget is for this so that you can plan this to best serve whatever you're trying to do here. So for budget, I typically like to start by going on Pinterest or just Googling for some blog posts, seeing if anyone has kind of a either like cost of living or how much does, a vacation in Iceland cost, some things like that. And I don't read every nitty gritty detail, but I'll pull quite a few up just so I can cross and compare. I find, especially for digital nomad content, that the blogs are not always as accurate, but I found some really good stuff here on YouTube. And if you are a digital nomad, I have a bunch of cost of living videos that I pride myself on being very accurate and very nitty gritty, like we count every penny so that you can have really good information of what it actually costs to live and travel in certain locations. But where this fits into your itinerary is as you're planning out all of the activities you're doing and accommodation and things like that. At the top of my itinerary, which I am going to show you in just a minute, I also always like to write down, okay, accommodation for Rome, if we're staying for 4 days, equals this much. Once we've already found our Airbnb and all of that, and I'll link it at the top. So I kind of link those fixed expenses so I know what those are going to be. And then as I'm going through my itinerary, like let's say on Monday, let's say we're going to go to the Louvre, then I'm going to link where I'm going to buy tickets and put in parentheses how much that's going to cost. So I can always look at things from a glance and even maybe put totals for what all those activities are going to cost at the top of the itinerary as well. Now, last tip on budgeting and finances here is that one, you need to make sure that you always have cash available. So a lot of other countries don't use credit cards the same way if you're American that Americans do. So make sure that you've got some cash readily available to be able to pull out in your bank account and get in local currency. The other thing is if you are traveling abroad, especially for extended periods of time, make sure that you have a credit card with 0 foreign transaction fees. Again, my favorite credit cards are pretty much all of the Chase ones, but specifically Chase Sapphire Preferred and Chase Sapphire Reserve. It's a tongue twister. I find that they're really great credit cards. And then Capital One also has some really good options, both for debit and credit cards as well. And lastly, just decide what you're willing to spend money on. For us, we're always willing to spend more money on an Airbnb, both to have a really good work environment and also to be in a good location. But for you, it may be something else. Remember though, that as you're planning out your budget, you're always going to spend more than you think you will. So just keep that in mind if you are someone who is traveling on a certain budget. A little side note here before we go into the fun part, which for me is the itinerary planning. If you're liking this episode, and again, you're looking for some of that inspiration, I actually also have a podcast episode and some podcast content that talks about my top digital nomad locations to either just live in or travel to that are really fun that I actually did with my partner to get his controversial opinions.
Like, I don't know that y'all want to hear me just talk about all this, so I decided Zach should come on the podcast today. He also works in the travel industry, and so he has a lot of insight on these locations, and sometimes we have differing opinions, so I think it'll be interesting for y'all to hear, more than one perspective.
I actually was going to say that. I was going to mention that we do differ actually pretty strongly on even some of the most popular digital nomad locations or remote work locations. So I'm excited to see how this kind of goes, because I know we've definitely had it out and had to flip coins at times to see where we were going to go next, and then booked a flight the next day. So I'm excited to get into it.
And it was a hot episode when it first came out. So definitely check that out in the link below there. Okay, so let's get into the planning process. And we're going to pull up my document here in just a second. So first thing you need to do is figure out what types of activities you want to do, right? Seems kind of obvious. Are you an arts person, a museums person? Are in the location you're doing, are there like must-have things that you want to do, outdoor things, etc.? So make sure you've got that in mind. And then the first thing I do is I pull up Pinterest and I pull up Google and I type in the locations. Let's say we are going to Chiang Mai, Thailand. Okay. So I'm going to start typing in Pinterest and Google and pull up Chiang Mai, things to do, things like that. And I'm just going to pull up a bunch of little tabs. For some of you that may give you anxiety. For me, I love it. Pull up a bunch of tabs and basically I just start with a brain dump. So from all these different blog posts and maybe YouTube videos as well, I'm going to pull and say, okay, everyone has mentioned Elephant Nature Park. So let's put that down, and I don't worry about it being organized, anything like that. I just put it all at the top of my Google Doc. So once I feel like things are starting to get repetitive and I've pretty much seen everything I want to see, or even asked in Facebook groups for recommendations, and I've got this really good juicy brain dump on my Google Doc, I then pull up my Google Doc and Google Maps. And what I'm going to do is basically put in almost every single location that I found. I typically do it in small chunks to see where they're located, because I like to organize my itineraries based on location so that I don't waste time traveling, far off all these random paths. And so that each next thing that I'm doing throughout a day is almost like on its way to the next thing. We like to travel efficiently. So from there, after you've started to see these locations, I group everything by locations on the Google Doc, and I'll start putting them onto certain days so that I can start actually planning what we're doing that day. Some days, especially if I have tickets for somewhere, or if I was supposed to go to Sunrise to see this location, I'll put, this needs to be at sunrise, this needs to be at a certain time. Other times I'll just say, hey, here's the 5 stops we want to hit today. We're going to do it at our own pace. You might want to add into your itinerary is certain restaurants. Typically when we travel, we don't put a ton of certain restaurants on the list, or like, oh, we have to eat here on Tuesday. You may want to do that. Typically we will have a list at the bottom of our itinerary that just says restaurants, and it's like any recommendations that we want. And then for us, we will say, okay, cool, for dinner tonight, which one do we want to go to? What I do, because I have celiac, aka I am medically gluten-free, I will always look up some fun gluten-free restaurants to try in different cities. So 3 bonus tips for you to make sure this goes smoothly. 1, make sure you check the weather for the time period that you're traveling, especially if it's like a shorter 1-week trip, because that's definitely going to affect like which days you're doing things and maybe what order of activities you're doing. Second thing is make sure you look up time estimates. So if you are in Paris and you're going to the Louvre, how long should you spend at the Louvre, right? That's going to be just some Googling, some reading blog posts, maybe some asking of some friends or some Reddit threads, different things like that is where I find that information. And that's going to be important, because if you put like 10 things in one day and everything takes 2 hours, like you're going to be really sad when all of a sudden you can't do all of those things. So make sure you look up time estimates. My third tip for you is, how we put everything into Google Maps to see where they are. Well, one of my favorite things to do is once I've got my days grouped, so day 1 is these 5 locations, I then go back and put the 5 locations in Google Maps again and make sure I have them in a certain order so I know which one to go to in what order, so that again, I'm not like crossing back and forth, and I can save that Google Maps link that's just showing me how to get from those 5 locations, and I will link it on my Google Doc so that day of I can pull up my Google Doc, click that Google Maps, and I've got everything ready to go. So we've got our itinerary, we've kind of maybe looked up like the path or certain things to do, but next you need to just look up how to get around. So my trusty steed, what is the phrase for that? I don't know, whatever I rely on is always Google Maps. So as you can see, I made like, little paths there. But regardless, I'm always just looking at Google Maps to see, which way do I turn? What's the best way to get there? And Google Maps is so great. Pretty much 99, if not 100% of the places that we go, unless you're like way out, in the wilderness, of telling us like bus systems, metro systems, things like that. Oh my gosh, in Paris, it was like, walk here, take this metro here, get off at this stop. Like it is just super amazing and reliable. But you may also want to look up in that city that you're going to, or in that country you're going to, what are the other ways people get around? Do they have Uber there? Do they have something like Uber there? Like in Bali, they have Grab, which is just basically like Uber. Is it safe to take taxis? How much should you expect to take taxis? Should they be using a meter? So again, depending on what countries you go to, that is going to be important for you to look up. The last piece of getting around is I really highly recommend you have a local SIM card. So again, if you're just going on a week-long vacation, maybe you can pay for like an overseas data plan, but I find those that they don't work that well. They're typically really expensive anyways, but especially if you're traveling extensively, make sure your phone is unlocked. And I always just pick up a local SIM card, either first thing when we get into a city or at the airport, and pop them in our phone, and you are ready to go with whatever the best data is for the location you're at. Okay, last thing for you before you hop on the plane is to prep you to show up. So what I mean by this is, if you're not an experienced traveler, and sometimes even as an experienced traveler, we don't always do this, but you want to know, what do I do? Because most of these trips we're talking about are going to be abroad, aka just not in the country you live in. So you want to know, what do you do when you show up? So if you've done research on, is there Uber or different things like that, make sure you look up how to get from the airport to wherever you're going. Again, are there certain types of taxis you should take? Is there a bus that you could take? Can you call an Uber? Things like that, so that you're not trying to figure that out when you land. The other important thing is you most likely won't have service when you land if you're getting into another country. So a lot of airports are great about having free Wi-Fi, but I never really want to have to rely on that. So I always save all my important documents and addresses and things like that so that I can access them without Wi-Fi. And then I also try and look up if it's available, because most of the time it is, but sometimes it's not, for me to get a SIM card in the airport there so I can make sure and pop that in and have service for wherever I'm getting to. The other thing is I typically take out money out of an ATM as soon as we land, just because I don't like going out into a city and not having any cash on me. So that's a step we do as soon as we land. And my last tip for you as far as being prepared to show up is don't expect everyone to speak English. So I'm obviously speaking to my native English speakers here, Americans, UK, Australians, etc., who are in countries where like English is pretty much the only thing spoken. Make sure that whatever country you are landing in, expect that people might not speak English, and you shouldn't expect them to either. You're showing up in their country, and when they come here, they don't expect you to speak Portuguese or French or whatever it is. So get your trusty app. What am I trying to say? Trusty Steed. I keep saying that. Anyways, I rely on Google Translate. If you can't tell, I love Google. I rely on Google Translate app on my phone, as well as the XE Currency app to help me mentally process like what currency should be. So I hope you enjoyed this video and are just like getting so excited to plan your next trip, and have really just seen how we make sure to be efficient with our travels, plan everything out so things go smoothly. As someone who literally travels full time, this is going to be key to you really enjoying your time in your next location. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can check out some of these other videos as well on our channel about all things marketing, sales, entrepreneurship, building an online business, and living this laptop lifestyle.